Great Big Sea. We're gonna watch a Great Big Sea video as soon as Dennis hits the play button. So Anita, does that look like St. John's? Yeah. Well, we were there this summer, and those streets seem very familiar now. So apparently, it's the end of the world. But in Newfoundland, they're pretty happy about it. It's the end of the world, but they feel fine. I guess they're used to tough things, and making it through. For all of human history, people have been trumpeting the end of the world, the end of the age, the end of an era. Things are changing. Things will never be the same. That's always true, right? Things are always coming to an end, and new things are being born. And depending on your perspective, the end of something can seem like a terrible, terrible thing. All depends on how you look at it. We're approaching the darkest time of the year. At least for those of us who live in the Northern Hemisphere, the amount of daylight has been diminishing a little bit each day in spite of daylight savings time. And that'll go on until the 21st of December, winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year, and therefore the longest night. After that, each day gets a little bit longer. There's a little more daylight, and the darkness gets pushed back a little more each day. We know that because it happens every year, and we've got calendars, and the internet keeps us well informed. But in earlier cultures, humans, our ancestors, did not always trust that the clockwork of the universe would keep on running. After watching the amount of sunlight diminish each day for the preceding months, there was a collective fear, or at least there were questions. If the sunlight is slipping away a little more each day, what if it doesn't come back? What if it never gets warm again? What if spring never comes? So some of these earlier cultures had rituals to ask the gods to please, please, please allow the light and warmth to come back. Ancient peoples would light these big bonfires, chant elaborate prayers, make offerings, dance around the fire, give things up. You had to be willing to make great sacrifices to win the favor of the sky gods. Please, bring back the sun. You had to pay tribute. People thought that way about their gods. I think because that was what they were used to. That's the way things worked on earth. If you wanted something from the boss of your town, from your earthly king, from your tribal leader, from your mother-in-law, you brought a tribute gift, basically a bribe. I'm going to give you something really nice because I need something. And, that's the way of the world still in many places. Many economies have an underground, sort of darker economy where nothing gets done unless you pay first. Laura talked a bit about that when we were reflecting on Tanzania. In some cultures, the temple was the place the bribes were brought. The sacrifices were made to curry the favor of the gods. So who collects these offerings? The holy guy, right? The priest guy, the temple guy. Then where do they go? Where does all that stuff go? Threatening people about it being the end of the world has always been big, big business. And many preachers gain their fame, make their fortunes, gather influence by selling their message about the end of the world. Have you noticed that politicians do that too? Not just me, right? If a politician who really wants to win an election, if their campaign went like this, things are going okay. Things are pretty good. If you vote for me, I'll try to keep it that way. There's hardly any reason to vote for them. You might as well leave your support with the person who's already in office. In other words, don't fix it if it ain't broke, right? That's not going to win an election. So often, the way it is done is to talk about how everything's going to hell in a handbasket. Everything's terrible. Vote for me. I'll drain the swamp. I'll make everything great again. I'll make sure the sun rises again. Trust me. You don't get elected by saying nice things about the opposition. That's just too bad. In the old days, when governments weren't elected, but tribes and countries were all run by warlords, a family got to be royalty by bashing in the heads of all their opponents. Now we just do it with words. Back then they did it with heavy implements of war. Think about this. Every royal family in the world, every one, including the ones we like, no matter how genteel and sophisticated they may seem now, every royal family has a history, if you look back far enough, that includes bashing in heads, includes violent and bloody conquering. Anybody here play checkers? Yeah. So you know the game, right? 64 squares on the board, alternating in colors. Each player gets 12 checkers. The object of the game is to be the one at the end who hasn't lost all their pieces. And you know how once you start playing, it only takes a few moves before you can't move anymore without jumping somebody. And if you don't jump, you lose your piece. As the game goes on, and you've jumped your way around the board, and you've taken off a bunch of your opponent's pieces, and they've taken off a bunch of yours, if their space has been cleared out, the opportunity may arise for you to get one of your checkers all the way to your opponent's side of the board, the first rank. And when you get there, what do you say? Crown me, king me, make me a king. And then your opponent has to take one of your checkers that got knocked off the board and crown your lowly checker. And now your double-decker checker can move backwards or forwards and becomes a powerful element in smashing those that are left. And you can take off more of your opponent's checkers. So here's the deal. No piece gets to be king unless others have been taken off, killed. In the world of checkers, there's no king without first killing a whole bunch of peasants. That's the game, right? Usually, a game of checkers ends with just a few pieces left, and the players chase each other around until only one color of pieces is left. Then they get to be the king of the empty board. Checkers is what game theorists call a zero-sum game. It's totally binary. Them and us, win or lose. There's no draw unless you get tired or somebody starts crying. Which could happen. I've seen that happen. On the church calendar, today is called Reign of Christ Sunday. We used to call it Christ the King Sunday. Well, in Canada, it has another name, right? Grey Cup Sunday. For some reason, Christ the King, or Reign of Christ Sunday, and Grey Cup Sunday usually fall on the same day. I don't know what that's about. Christ the King Sunday, unlike Grey Cup Sunday, was instituted in 1925 by Pope Pius XI. 1925. Pope Pius in the Vatican, in the heart of Italy, in the heart of Europe. The bloody and brutal battles of the First World War were pretty fresh memories. All around him, fascism, extreme right-wing nationalism was on the rise in Italy, in Germany, Spain, other places. The Pope decided to add this new event to the church calendar, a feast, Christ the King. It was his way, we think, of saying your ultimate hope, the thing you should trust. Put your faith, your hope, your trust in God, not in a head of state. Especially not if there's somebody like Mussolini or Hitler or who else can you think of? History has shown us over and over again what terrible things happen when devotion to a political leader or even just a political view takes on religious fervor. I know some of my American friends have been worried all week about how to talk with, to be with, even sit around the same table with some of their friends and relatives for the American Thanksgiving holiday without getting into ideological arguments. In some places, maybe you know places like this, there's a climate in which asking questions or voicing concern about the current government is seen as disloyal, almost sacrilegious. So by declaring a feast day called Christ the King, this old Pope, Pius, was asking a really good question. Who's in charge? Who do we bow down to? What kind of king would God be? Earthly kings, elected officials, heads of corporations, priests and preachers, all of us human leaders, even the best of us, make mistakes. We're subject to pride, to ego, to self-interest. We play favorites. We have biases. We make messes. We forget stuff. If Jesus was a king, he'd be a different kind of king. He'd be fair all the time. He would be just. He would be moral. He would be ethical. His methods would be love, compassion, empathy, understanding, patience. He would always be trustworthy, kind, and good. Earthly kings, politicians, elected people, others, use threats, punishing laws, violence, armies to defend themselves and to enact their plans. Earthly kings are egotistical, whimsical, selfish, and often cannot be relied upon to do the right thing or even to understand what the right thing is. They let their own biases, prejudices, preferences, fears, and really bad ideas get in the way of their duty. Earthly kings too often still act like those early warlords and village leaders who play favorites based on who brings them the nicest tribute, the biggest bribe. The God that Jesus came to teach us about, the God of creation, the one who actually set the stars and planets in motion and makes the days follow the nights and makes spring follow winter, our God isn't like that. Our God isn't petty. Our God can't be bought or influenced to take the side of one team or another in a football game or an election or in a dispute between countries or any of the other little arguments we get in our human checkerboard. Because God loves all the players, all the pieces, the whole board. God actually wants to change the game from a win-win or from a win-lose, zero sum where someone has to walk away crying and someone else gets all the pieces and the whole board, to win-win, to a way of being that isn't about power and violence, but about love and cooperation and compassion. It's about vulnerability and mercy and kindness and room for everyone at the whole table, not just on some silly little game board. So Christ the King Sunday, Reign of Christ Sunday, it's the last Sunday of the year on the Christian calendar. Next year we start a whole new Christian year. It'll be Advent, the 4 weeks of preparing for the coming of Christmas, the celebration of the birth of Jesus. We're still headed into winter. Days are still getting shorter. Now we wait. We are called to place our trust, our hopes, not in some earthly king or politician or doom and gloom prophet who wants to profit from our anxieties and our fears about the end of the world. We begin again this wait for the birth of a game changer who arrives not as royalty in some fancy castle with moats and guard towers and silk sheets, but as a vulnerable, needy, helpless little baby who gets born into a primitive barn, sleeps in a feed trough, and right from the beginning shows us something about right and wrong and about love. Amen.